welcome everybody to this special presentation for St. Bridget's Day. And St. Bridget, as we know, is kind of an avatar of women who has emerged in the last few years, almost as a counterweight to St. Patrick, and it's very kind of patriarchal themes and so on. And St. Bridget reaches very far back into our pagan past, and then she is converted to a Christian saint, but throughout has been a very powerful figure, a goddess of fire, of manufacturing, of creativity. And in her new incarnation, I think she's an inspiration for women who take leadership positions, who are involved in business, and a very inspirational figure. And it's great to see the development of St. Bridget's Day as a focal point for discussions around the empowerment of women. And today we're going to focus on women, peace and security. And I'm joined by an absolutely tremendous panel. So they've put me in a position of chair, but I will rapidly retreat to the back of the chariot, I have to say, in the face of the talent, power and leadership here today. I'll do a brief introduction. We're joined by Niamh Kelly, a first secretary from our Perm rep in New York at the United Nations. And she's had, I'd say, a very busy 2 years because we've been on the Security Council. And we'll get some insights from her on that. We're also joined by Commander Roberta O'Brien, who's had a storied career in our defence forces, was one of the first women to join, I think the first woman to join the Navy with a friend of hers back in 1995. Rapidly rose through the ranks to take command, the first woman to command one of our ships, the Ashling, in 2008. And is currently involved in defence capacity building with NATO under Ireland's Partnership for Peace. We're also joined by Eleanor O'Gorman. Delighted to have her with us because myself and Eleanor worked together in building the conflict resolution unit in the Department of Foreign Affairs many, many years ago. And it was Eleanor came in, and after a couple of days in working with us in Foreign Affairs, she turned to me and said, "Is this it? Is this all there is?" And she says, "Because you guys have a great reputation." So she suddenly realized Foreign Affairs was a Wizard of Oz operation. We punch above our weight. But Eleanor has been involved in the study of women in conflict and the ways that we can empower them. And it was thanks to her that we adopted UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And we've had a number of national action plans since then. So she's currently based in Cambridge and works as a consultant as well after many, many years of experience with the NGOs. And I'm delighted to see Sally Armstrong again. She was a keynote speaker at a gala event I was hosting and gave a tremendous speech. But Sally is a renowned and I could say decorated journalist, a writer, human rights activist, but she's been reporting from war zones around the world, the Middle East, particularly Afghanistan, but also in Africa. And she's had a keen eye and a mighty pen when it comes to the issues of women, and particularly women caught in conflict, young women, older women, women in societies in which they are almost deliberately disempowered. And so we're really delighted to have her with us. So I'll hand over to Sally, who will make some opening comments, and then we will open the floor to discussions with a focus on 1325 conflict and the empowerment of women on this St. Bridget's Day. Over to you, Sally.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, happy St. Bridget's Day, everybody. Excuse me, and I must say I'm just delighted to have been invited to join this panel. But before we begin, I have to make a confession. In fact, two confessions. Now, the ambassador has preempted me on that. I wanted to say to you, they already met your very charming ambassador when he was the MC and I was the guest speaker at a UN event. I have to say he was probably the best part of the evening. My second comment is that in June, I went hiking on the Wild Atlantic Way in Ireland. And between those two, I have to say, I am totally smitten by Ireland, by Irish people, by all things Irish. So having said that, I had to find out about St. Bridget. I'd never heard of her. And I researched her. What a dame. You know, she reminded me of Marie, the prioress who became abbess in Matrix, that best-selling book by Lauren Grove. So I want to say to you that about a week before St. Bridget's Day, the New York Times had a story about whether or not the male of the species was doing as well as he had been doing in the past. They said that in South Korea, the girls were outperforming the boys at school. They said in Sweden, the boys were suffering a crisis of confidence. They said that in US colleges, women were starting to outnumber male students by 2 to 1. The question they asked was this: is the second sex becoming the better half? Well, what a lovely suggestion. Although I'm not in favor of any sex being any better than any other sex, and I really don't understand why we can't all do best together. But it's interesting, isn't it? Every time women and girls take a step forward, there are headlines about men and boys. And here we go again. But before they go celebrating the advancement of women, and indeed, there have been enormous advances in the last, the last 100 years, but the last several decades to be precise, I think they need to look at the topic that you have taken on today. Women with resistance and resilience are the very ones we celebrate because they're the very ones who have brought us to where we are in this journey. In fact, the New York Times journalist only has something to write about because of these women. I'm a journalist. I work in zones of conflict, and my beat is to find out what happens to women and girls in places like Afghanistan, Bosnia back in the day, Iraq, Iran, places where everyone's in trouble, but women are particularly targeted. I can tell you, now is the hour for resistance and resilience, both there and right here. And thankfully, we're not alone. You know, the other night, I went to see a movie, and now I've discovered it's been nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. It's called Women Talking. I urge you to see that film. You know, the women in the film, what they do painstakingly is what we all need to do. They ask the impolite questions. They give voice to truth. And they use resistance and resilience to deal with life-altering issues. So on St. Bridget's Day, let us do the same. Let us ask about violence against women. Let us ask why, despite the actions women have taken, this continues to be a scourge in our society, an incredibly expensive scourge. Let us ask how the world can let the Taliban deny women and girls the rights granted to them by the UN Charter and declarations that Afghanistan signed. Let us ask how on earth the Ayatollahs in Iran deny women human rights when they also signed the Declaration of Human Rights. Let us ask how we can immediately stop violence against women everywhere. Consider what women have done about violence, particularly intimate partner violence. We changed the law. In Canada, we even put it into the Constitution. We pumped up awareness. We built shelters all over the place so that our sisters could find safety. But what happened? Almost nothing. The statistics have barely budged. While the rest of the issues around women have been changing fairly rapidly, these statistics did not. You know, it's known as a women's problem. It's not a women's problem. It's a men's problem. And it's high time the men took on this $1.3 trillion problem that's affecting half of the world's population. Like the film Women Talking, it's time men did the talking. I have no doubt that most men are abhorred by violence against women. But why don't they stand up in public and say so? Where are the sports heroes' voices? Where are the pop stars' voices? Why doesn't the CEO of a bank tell his 400,000 employees If you are harming your partner, I will fire you because that is criminal behavior. If you need help with your temper or the violence you're experiencing, we'll get help for you. But if you don't get help, you cannot work at this bank. Have you ever heard a CEO of a bank say that? I never have. In fact, if you look at the corporate world, you have to ask yourself here in 2023 on St. Bridget's Day, how is it possible women still don't have equal pay? How is it possible that sexual harassment and sexual assault still make headlines in the police force and the military? How is it possible that a female journalist or a female, repeat, this is not a women's problem, this is a men's problem. In the film Women Talking, and I keep talking about it because I'm so stunned, I only just saw it and I just had to tell you about it. But what they do is they tell the awful truth. They get mad at each other for talking too much, for not saying enough. They fight back and forth, they accuse each other, and then they hug each other, and then together they make a decision. It is a master class in resistance and resilience. You know, today we are witnessing the courage and tenacity of women who are trying to cut the ties that bind them to brutality and injustice. Remember Rahaf Mohammed? She was the girl at the age of 18 who ran away from Saudi Arabia because her father was going to kill her. And she made it as far as Bangkok before they caught up with her. And then she barricaded herself in a hotel room and she went on Twitter to save her own life. And she tweeted her story out to the world, and the world tweeted back to her. I became her ghostwriter. The book is called Rebel, and it is all about resilience and resistance. Last week, I was on assignment for the Globe and Mail to do a story out of Iran about what the women are up to. You know, those awful Ayatollahs, they thought this protest would be a 3-day event. It's now in its 5th month, and young women are cutting their hair, burning their hijabs, going to the street and shouting, life, women, freedom. You know, it's social media that gave this protest its wings. It's all over the country on Instagram and TikTok. And that unity all over the country is what might be the ticket that makes them succeed. This protest began because of the killing of a 22-year-old girl, Gina Mahsa Amini. They killed her. The Revolutionary Guards killed her for wearing her hijab incorrectly. Can you just imagine that? And these courageous women, they just might be the ones to overthrow the Ayatollahs. And as my research said, that will change the entire region for the better. But it's costing. It always costs women when they're trying to make change. Human Rights Watch reported in November that there's been 341 protesters and 52 of them children who've been killed by the guards during this protest. More than 15,000 arrests have been made for charges such as enmity against God and corruption on earth. They both carry the death penalty, by the way. And then there's Afghanistan. I've been covering Afghanistan since 1996. I'm still covering Afghanistan. And people are very quick to say, well, that 20-year period when the international community arrived was a failure. Let me tell you this. During that 20-year period, the life expectancy of an Afghan went from 47 years to 63 years. That's not a failure. That's a miracle. But look at it now. How come our hands are tied? Is it not time to sit down together and make some new demands? If you refuse education to your girls and work to your women, we will stop you. If you treat your women and girls as property, we will not trade with you. If you hurt your partner and refuse help, we will fire you. I hope that today, the work we're doing together can allow us to come up with some solutions to change the course so that women, by resisting and by being resilient, can create a life that is safer and more just and much better for their daughters. I have to say in closing, it's times like this, I cannot fail but think of Maya Angelou and her incredible poem, And Still We Stand. Remember, she wrote, "You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Sally. You covered an awful lot there, and certainly the impression I have is that if we were to do and renew an agenda for women, it would include such things as don't murder me, don't torture me, don't lock me away, don't refuse me education and freedom, and that's a sobering thought. And I have two daughters myself, and I was hiking with Courtney one day just in the Wicklow Mountains, and she said, I would never do this on my own because I'd be nervous as a young woman on my own in the foothills of Dublin. And so, and I just make that point because it's everywhere. It's not just in Afghanistan with the awful Taliban and so on. It's in our streets. And as you say, there's a responsibility there on us as men to begin to become advocates that the problem was created by us. We'll no doubt return to many of the rich topics you've touched on there. Just because you mentioned it at the beginning about the responsibility of men, I might turn to Commander O'Brien, Roberta. I was quite struck by the fact that in Aherlow, you joined the hurling team with the boys, and you then joined a notoriously male environment, the military, back in 1995, which, God, think about it, it's almost 30 years ago. Just to pick up on that topic of men's responsibility and your experiences of dealing with what the kind of the sporting but also the military realm and how you've responded to that, and what do you make of Sally's kind of call for men to take more responsibility?
Well, to start from the start with my story and why I joined the all boys hurling team, it very much came from coming from a very much feminist background of mother and father, but for sure my mother, who was a very strong advocate that there shouldn't be any opportunities restricted to me just because I was a woman. And I was big into sports, and you're on about advocates. I came from a big family, 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Not a lot to do out in the countryside. So we played hurling and out the front. And it was my older brother who said, look, if you want to go playing, just go up and start playing at lunchtime. And that's what I did. In national school, I went up, and the headmaster, he was a very tall, strong, loud person from Cork who, pulled no punches. Like, he said what he wanted to say. And initially when he saw me, he says, what was I doing up here? But I actually just blocked that out because I had a friend who actually said it to me recently. She said, Roberta, I couldn't believe that you kept playing. And I said, well, I was up there to play hurling. I didn't care whether he thought I could. And after a few minutes, the rest of the team, the fellas that were there, because it was all the boys, because I went to a mixed primary school, they just treated me like another person who wanted to play hurling and didn't distinguish. So that's where I think what Sally was saying about male advocates and people, if they see that you're there wanting to take part in the job or the sport that you want to do, and you're mean business in general, most men will advocate and support you in that endeavor. I fast forward then to when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do when I left school, looked at the naval service, and sadly, we'll be on about resistance and change and how things, it was 1995. That's hard to believe that it took that long for them to allow women to even join, which is crazy. But again, I was very fortunate. About 90% of the fellas that I came across in the naval service were strong advocates who encouraged me throughout my training to become an officer and ultimately take command of my own ship in 2008. But it definitely didn't come all rosy in the garden. There was those negative comments from some men. And I remember my first patrol in particular, sitting down having my lunch break during the watch, you'd go back up onto the bridge. And one particular individual was being quite nasty to me. And in fairness, my male colleagues within the naval service pulled that fella aside and had words with him. So this where it comes to male advocates having the moral courage in calling people out on their bad behaviours. Because look, I'm not going to be naive and say that it was all plain sailing, pardon the pun, but the majority of people have sisters, have mothers, grannies, you know what I mean? And they realise if somebody wants to do the job, that they're there to support them. So yeah.
Right. And over those years, do you think it has improved?
I think it has improved, but we still have a long way to go. And sadly, with our most recent documentary that was released in Women of Honour, and you'd be on about people with great moral courage and resilience to speak out. As a result of that, I think our Chief of Staff is handling the situation very well. He's, again, we're having conversations at the senior, the highest levels. And it's interesting to hear Sally mentioning it, that it's not just a women's issue. He brought a number of us currently serving senior females, both non-commissioned officers and officers within the Defence Forces. And we had an online hybrid meeting, and he wanted to hear open and honestly our opinion. And I remember saying to him that day, I said, sir, I said, this is not a women's issue to solve. It's not up to us to solve it. I said, this is a leadership. This is an organizational challenge. And in fairness, I believe the Chief of Staff has rightly spoken out against that and is promoting to try and change the cultural change, because it's not everybody within the organization. There's a small percentage that have been allowed to have that voice and put people through those terrible scenarios and situations that those women of honor with great moral courage spoke out about.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point as well that we in Ireland have come from decades of a very repressive Catholic Church in which women's position was highly constrained, but that those who broke through that were heroic women like Mary Robinson, Nell McCafferty, Mary McAleese, and real champions. But it was the women that took up those challenges. You know, we'll come back to that, no doubt. Eleanor, I mean, you've been in different milieus, both government as well as NGO. And you've combined a kind of rigorous academic approach with an understanding of how power works. Can you just give us some insights about what are the most propitious circumstances for the advancement of women, and what are the kind of institutional blockages you've come across? I mean, are they kind of deeply atavistic, or are there more structural reasons why the evolution of women to a proper status in society and in life and in power has been so frustrated?
Thanks, Eamon. No, I mean, I think Roberta hit the nail on the head with talking about organizational cultures. A lot of the changes, I would say, in the first wave, even if we look at like 1325 and women, peace and security, a lot of it was about changing the legal framework, setting quotas. Let's try and appoint more women as special representatives at the UN, for example. Let's try and include more women into diplomatic negotiations, peace talks. You're very aware of that, Eamon. But I do think that I speak quite frankly. I worked in the UN, I've worked with NGOs, I've worked as an academic. I have found institutional resistance to gender in the most shocking places. And I have found humanitarian aid workers and peace builders to be just as likely as the military to house that resistance. And I would imagine the media as well, Sally. It's not easy being on the front line reporting stuff. But we've also come a ways, and I think it is about leadership, and it is about modeling that, and it's about accountability. I think it's following through. And if we look at the UN, for example, I mean, there's been long running talk about sexual harassment within the organization, but also sexual exploitation and abuse with regard to aid recipients. It has rumbled on, and there have been ethics offices and investigations, etc., but no real accountability. And there was a documentary last year. I couldn't even bring myself to watch it, actually, because I've heard so much over the years, interviewing a number of women who had recent cases and had left. So I think it's a human issue. It's a society issue. So it's no surprise it shows up everywhere. But I think some of the signals to me are about power and empowerment. So I would say that it also depends where the women are placed and the backing they have. there's been a lot of emphasis, for example, in the peace building field around mediator networks and diplomatic postings and positions. And that's important as far as it goes. But in fact, it doesn't change the dynamics of how the table is built, who's at the table, etc. And I think one of the exciting developments for me in a younger generation is the spontaneous rise of local women's movements, youth movements, not just women and men. Sally talked about Iran. I was in Lebanon in late 2021 and was super impressed by a dynamic, young, organic kind of movement of women and LGBTQ, and they were driving change in a way that even the classic NGOs and aid system couldn't really deal with. And also they're coming from inside their own countries. They're not waiting for someone to come and sort it out for them. They're, you know, sorting out their own lives. So I also think that the narratives have changed around women's stories. Too often they were commodified as victims of war and as the faces of humanitarian aid, for example, and why aid should be given, rather than being empowered. And going back to Bosnia, one of the things that really angered me in the early 90s and kind of got my fire going on this issue was the women being bussed out of Srebrenica after the terrible rapes and murders. And the BBC, the good old BBC, reporting that there were alleged incidents of rapes. They were literally talking to the women falling off the buses whose husbands and sons had been taken and shot. They'd been raped, but they couldn't, it had to be verified. And this issue of evidence and proving yourself, whether it's in a court of law as a rape victim or whether it's a war crime in a conflict zone, it has not changed. And I've been in and around the Security Council when I've heard debates for thresholds of evidence that I do not see happening for other issues, you know, and building the evidence and cases for that. So I think those structural things are there, but they only change with new leadership, new people and new ways of doing things. And I think creating alliances across institutions. So I think one of the good things is, and I'm sure Niamh probably finds this working at the UN in New York, is you're working across a range of stakeholders. It's not just the government you represent. And so it's building those alliances to keep driving change forward.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point you make as well about the resistance in large organizations, but also that, and something we all struggle with in change, which is, and the only kind of way I can describe it is structural memory, that no matter how much you push something to change, it kind of bounces back again. Like, for example, the bounce back on, oh, we have to have the evidence, or we have to have balanced reporting. And you suddenly find out, oh, well, that ends up with this consequence against our interest and agenda and so on. I think we can come back to that. And the other idea of that self-empowerment and the role of social media in that, which allows people to connect in ways that they could never do. We might come back to that. I wanted to talk to Niamh then, as an officer of this department, and our department is not perfect either. No department is. But you've been at the UN, you've seen it through the Security Council. I know you've had a focus on 1325 and women, peace and security. Be interested in your kind of comments on the UN kind of disposition towards these agendas at the moment and how you see it going.
Yeah, thanks, and hi to all colleagues, and happy St. Bridget's Day as well, and really pleased to have the opportunity to be a part of this discussion. Yeah, listen, we've had a really intense 2 years working on the Security Council as an elected member for 2021 and 2022. You know, some of the colleagues have mentioned Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which was really a groundbreaking piece of work. And has really, you know, forced the hand of the Security Council in terms of dealing with and kind of mainstreaming gender perspectives through all the work that it does. But we still do have a long way to go in that regard as well. And I mean, I often do ask myself, if 1325 were tabled today for the first time, would it be successful? Would it pass? Would it get 15 affirmative votes and consensus that it did back in the year 2000? And kudos to Namibia for spearheading it at the time. But I think probably the answer to that question is no. unfortunately. And that's a reflection of the dysfunction of the Security Council, current dynamics at the Security Council table, particularly in the aftermath of the Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but also the kind of regression we're seeing in the space of women's and girls' rights more generally. So I think 1325 is really unique in that sense, and we're very fortunate to have that foundation that we do have to build on, although it's not perfect and there's a long way to go. It is very unique, and it's not something we've been able to achieve in other thematic areas. For example, you think of the discussion around climate and security, where Ireland we tabled a resolution in 2021 with Niger, which was vetoed by Russia and also not supported by India, in spite of really broad support within the general UN membership. So I think the space for these discussions, unfortunately, is increasingly challenging. And one of the things that I found in my experience here in New York has been, it's all well and good to talk about women, peace and security kind of from a thematic or kind of broad general context, and to show up at an open debate in October or around International Women's Day and to say nice things. But when we get into the nitty gritty and we're talking about country specific situations, we're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about Yemen, that's when we really hit resistance. So there's a long way to go, but we have made strides, and it was a priority for Ireland in our 2 years on the council. We've stood up for Afghan women's rights in a really tangible way. It's something we mainstreamed across our work, especially bringing women, civil society to the council table. And that's not something that all UN Security Council members believe in or agree in, but it's what others mentioned about amplifying voices of women on the ground and being able to hear their stories. And they don't want us to speak for them by any means. They want us to amplify their voices and to give them the platforms to share their experiences.
Yeah, some really interesting comments you have there, which I think are very sobering when you use words like regression. And I wonder whether or not, and because I think it is the case, we've certainly seen, I think, a rollback of this notion of the universal applicability of human rights, and that is that we have come across resistance in that with the war against Ukraine, Yemen, the instability that flowed from the Iraq war, for example, right across the Middle East. In a way, we've entered a period of hard power, and hard power is always about men and machines and the war and military, and we don't have time for all of this kind of human rights stuff. And that broader narrative is the one that has this impact on the progression of women's rights, then that just falls away. So it is quite sobering for you to assess at this stage that 1325 may not have the votes that it did have back in 2000, It's a really, it's quite sobering that not only are we trying to evolve and advance women's rights, but in fact, it's now under siege from kind of your perspective within the UN. The failure, in a way, to create a UN organization around women, because it was kind of a UN Women was that a significant kind of moment? And maybe Eleanor, you want to speak to that?
Eamon, I think that's very true. I think UN Women came about 10 or 15 years too late. I mean, it was trying to create itself as a UNICEF or just as multilateralism was declining. In fact, we still haven't done the necessary UN reforms, I think, to make it effective for now. But I think the UN also can't be too bashed. I think it can only do as much as the political will allow. And that isn't just limited to the recalcitrant members of the Security Council. There's plenty of European and other countries playing politics as well. And cutting aid budgets, for example, and cutting support to civil society, to peace building, to gender programs, which have been a mainstay. But I do think, Eamon, what's amazing, I think, around this work is the synergy that exists between women's movements. And I don't even want to say civil society, because some of them don't have names. They can go to schools, individuals, down to very local levels. Frankly, on another level, I could say to Niamh, and I was there when 1325 passed, I was part of the push. I was in the UN at that time. But it was civil society. It was women's organizations all around the world that had created the platform for 1325. Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, others came in and pushed it and profiled, and governments came in. But frankly, if 1325 didn't exist today, the amazing cooperation and communication, and as you said, Eamon, earlier, accelerated by social media, is connecting women. Some of the best dialogues I've seen have happened between women in Syria and Bosnia. Completely different wars, you could argue, different decades, and yet pushing together, learning from each other. And that kind of transnational network is there, and it doesn't need money. It obviously would strengthen and grow if it had it, but needs must. People are reaching out. I'm sure the women in Ukraine are connecting and being connected with women and people who've been there before and can bring lessons. So I think UN Women, I think, is a great recognition of the global advances, but having, for example, had gone toe-to-toe with Peacekeeping Operations Office and the Political Affairs Office, so on mediation and peacekeeping, some of us did feel that the arrival of UN Women set back the work that had been happening for DPKO to take up.
Why? Because it was kind of corralled somewhere else. Was that?
Yes, you get back to the gender focal point. It's like the minute you appoint a woman in an organization to be,
yeah, that's done. Yeah,
it's gone. Oh, she's dealing with it, and then there's one person left. Whether it's frankly to do with being an ethnic minority or being a woman. And the focal point system has failed over and over again. It comes back to your fact of structural change it's not enough. It has to happen at the top. It has to be in the business plans, the budgets, the strategy, the results, the promotions. You've got to show you're back in this agenda and you're working on it. And and there is that. And I'm afraid we have the classic interagency politics, and they play out in government departments too. Oh, yeah. I've been around the world where there have been, ministries of gender and children's affairs, women and children into one ministry. There's never any money. They have no access to the president's office, and they're relying on trickles, from the international aid budgets. So I'm not saying that it's not important to have an office. I just think you've got to think about what the purpose of these kinds of structures are. To drive change.
No, it can be a very good point. I mean, it is a very good point. I think that very often, and we've seen that, and you and I have been in situations where you meet these police officers in the context of security sector reform, and they kind of laugh and point to the end of the table. Oh yeah, we have her. She's dealing with sexual violence, and so I don't have to deal with it. Yeah. I want to just tack back as well to Sally on the point that many of you raised, which is the empowerment of social media, almost a kind of fruitful anarchy going on outside of power structures that social media has allowed. I don't think that's what's happening in Iran, for example, could be possible without mobile phones. Sally, did you want to speak to some examples of how social media has empowered and allowed women to connect and share experiences that allow them to say, oh yeah, I'm actually in a completely mad situation here? Because women can be normalized to the most abnormal situations. And is social media a kind of an antidote to that? Sally?
Well, actually, there's so many things I want to comment on to come back to the various stories you've just told or comments you've just made. As for social media, it is very effective. It's also a huge problem. And it's another example of why you have to ask yourself, why does Google, Facebook, Twitter, why do they allow these dreadful comments to be made to people like me and my colleagues and you and your colleagues on social media? So social media does bring us together, but it's also the greatest source of conspiracy theory. It is also where sexual harassment is blooming. So I think that's a good and bad news story. But there's a couple of points I want to make. You're talking about how the men are growing in power. I would like to point out that during the pandemic, the countries that did best were countries run by women. Finland, Germany, New Zealand, for example. The countries that did the worst in the pandemic were countries run by populist men like Trump in the US, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, and even in Hungary. And I think this is not only about 1325. This is not only about the functioning of the UN. This is people rising up, and this is women being at the table that 1325, of course, said. And Eleanor, I have to tell you that in Canada, we toasted all of you the night that it was passed. We all came together, at least the women's movement in Toronto, to toast this wonderful move. But the problem is, and it comes to every single thing all of us have said, is we know how to make a difference, and yet we cannot do it. And we have to find a way to untie those knots. It's not enough. It's not enough for us to be able to say, well, that women did well, women leaders did well in the pandemic. We have to be able to deal with those who are putting women down to the point they're wrecking their own economies. They're certainly damaging the health level of their people. And there's one other, if you don't mind, if I'll just quickly say, regarding the media, Eleanor, I also covered the Srebrenica, and I want to just tell you this quick story. I was in Sarajevo doing a story on the effect of war on children when I first heard about the gang raping of women in Bosnia. And as a journalist, we know that one of the first casualties of war is usually the truth. So you have to be very, very careful about what you report. But as I was leaving the next day, I had my story. But as this day went on, I heard more and more credible evidence that this was actually going on. I was working at a magazine. I could rush this story to press in 3 months. So I came to Canada the next day and I gave it to a huge news agency in Toronto. And I said, send a reporter. This is world news. And 7 weeks later, I phoned him back and said, whatever happened? He said, oh, I was on deadline. I got busy. It was a good idea, but I forgot. I said, 20,000 women were gang raped, some of them 8 years old, some of them 80 years old, and you forgot? He said, oh, Sally, you're always going on and on about the women. Fast forward, I was on a plane 2 days later, did the story. I'm ashamed to say I won so many awards for that story on the back of the brave woman, Eva Penovich, who was willing to tell it. And I can tell you this, I worked for a magazine in Canada. If that story happened today, I would be at the end of a very long line of very well-known international journalists who would be reporting it. Because when I was there in Sarajevo, CNN was there, BBC was there, the Globe and Mail was there, the New York Times, they were all there. But today, women's issues are on the front page. What is not being done is we are not able to stop those who see women as sex slaves, as not part of society, and not worth human rights. Sorry, I took a long time, but I wanted.
No, that's fine, and it's a very well taken point about how social media can magnify the negative and stereotypes and cluster people together with very malign psychosis and views and so on. I wanted to ask a question because it often pops up, and all of you have touched on this, which is about the number of women in an organization. And picking up on your point, Sally, we know, for example, that during the financial crisis, banks that were run by women had much less exposure and so on. They just don't take the risks that men do. But I wanted to ask a question around quotas. Should organizations be mandated on the basis of quotas for women's entry into them? Maybe Roberta, throw that live wire over at you. In an organization that's predominantly male, do you think they should have quotas? And if you were commander, if you're the chief of staff, would that be something on your agenda or not? And if not, why?
I've changed my views on this over the years, and I think this comes with the naivety of youth. When you join an organization, you think, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to get to the top of my position no matter what. But I think we've all touched on it there, Eleanor, Sally and Niamh, like the structures that are in place that are seen as meritocracy. When you are a bit longer in the organization, they aren't as meritocratic as we think. They're not as fair and as even. So when we talk about meritocracy, does such thing exist with subjectivity and all that with personalities? So to answer your question, I would look at it and would look at introducing it, but with different caveats at stake, be it that a position at a much higher level and two candidates, all things being equal and going for interview, that you would have to at some stage allow the female ahead of their male counterpart. But I wouldn't just bring in quotas for the sake of it. It would have to be looking at the best person for the job. Are they capable of doing the work that's required? And then how you actually put that into either a promotion structure. And then going back then, as I look across my own peers currently, and it's amazing how there's no official mentorship, but I see it happening amongst the senior male officers, that you see the younger men are being given better opportunities. Now it's very difficult to prove that, but what is seen as the Gucci project, or the one that's going to give that younger officer the opportunities. So again, as a senior leader in the organization, when I go back to my own naval service and the Defence Forces, I would look at that needs to be looked at on how we actually have to bring in official mentorship and giving equity. It's not even equality. We're going to equity of opportunity for our women within organizations. So that's how I would see about promoting the agenda. And that's where we spoke about UNSCR 1325, how it's been good for myself from a military perspective. It's caused our organization, both when we go on peacekeeping missions, but internally, to look at our numbers. And it isn't just add women and stir. You want people who are advocates, who incorporate the gender perspectives, both how a war situation affects men, women, boys, and girls differently, or how your policies from an internal structure, how they affect men and women differently. I'm a staunch feminist, and as a young 20-year-old, I thought, oh yeah, there's nothing is going to change. I can progress the same way as my male counterpart. But sadly, I've come, as I became a mother of 3 children, there are different decisions that I have to make as I climb the ladder within my organization that are very distinct and unique to a woman than my male counterpart. And it's not that my male colleagues don't want to have families, and they certainly do support their partners in equal rearing of the children. But there are certain decisions as women that are just that different to the men. And it's slowly happening, but it's still, we've introduced, it took nearly 12 years to bring in a maternity policy into the Defence Forces, to say to HR, like, we do need this. It's not a case-by-case basis, because you need to be able to advocate for the most junior rank to the highest rank. So I suppose to answer your question in a long-winded manner is that I would be an advocate, but I wouldn't just do a blank sweep and quotas for the sake of quotas. It would have to be brought in and measured, because you don't want to take this perception or create this backlash. Certainly it can happen in one domination, even in the nursing field, and say in military, if one gender is dominant over the other, it can create the backlash. So you want to have that balance if you bring them in. But I think we've gotten to the stage where we aren't able to increase the numbers past that critical mass. Certainly in the military, we've stagnated at that 6% to 7%, and we need to get that increase to drive that impetus for change.
Yeah, I think it's I think your answer is a very subtle one, actually, because, and I've come across it in our own organization in Foreign Affairs, a number of things that you mentioned, the almost biological structure against women, because they're the ones, raising the kids and giving birth, and how that biases their trajectory within the department. I've often seen as well what you described there, where it can be a posting or a promotion or a placement in the job that is a gateway one, and that suddenly defaults to the boys' club, as it were. And it can be that discrimination can be very subtle. It seems to suit an organization's interest, but you could see where women's careers suddenly go off track at some point they didn't get the gateway promotion that is going to lead to other things. So I think your answer is very subtle and comprehensible. That it's not, again, just about a lump kind of some quota. It actually has to reach deeper into an organization's biases and pathways to greater power. Just going to Niamh, I mean, the UN is in many ways, paradoxically, a very powerful organization and a very disempowered one, because as Eleanor said, it is dependent on the member states, what it can do. Do you think it's on the right course for putting more women in positions of power, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, firstly, I mean, I have to say I totally agree with Roberta, what she mentioned about it's not about add women and stir, and quotas for the sake of quotas aren't always effective. And one thing, moving away from the numbers point, I think, is the types of roles that you see women in, at the UN, in my own experience, just in general in international relations in the department. I think we have to do better at thinking about the roles that women do and the roles that men do. And you have this kind of idea, at least at the UN, in my own anecdotal experience, that, you see more men doing the kind of hard security issues, peace, security, disarmament, nuclear disarmament, etc. And then you have more women working on human rights, women, peace and security, humanitarian access, etc. And you really do see those divides. And I was struck myself. I mean, I've spent the last 2 years working on the Middle East and North Africa, where we had more men than women. And I recently took over the human rights portfolio, and my first EU coordination, so a coordination meeting between the 27 EU member states on the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women, which is taking place at the UN in March. And I think there was only like 3 or 4 men at the table. And I was really shocked, that even within the EU, delegations are sending women to talk about women's issues and men to talk about issues of hard peace and security. So I think, aside from the quota point, it's also a matter of the nature of the roles and kind of breaking through those preconceived or unconscious notions that we have about the type of work that women can have. And it goes back to what Eleanor was saying also about ministerial portfolios. You see that women ministers are often working on social issues rather than issues of finance or justice or whatever. So there's a lot to unpack, and there's a long way to go. I mean, the UN itself, in terms of structural change, I mean, you do have more women in leadership positions, but again, it's not just about putting women in leadership positions. It's about the nature of the work that they can do. I mean, if I'm just thinking, for example, I think a really interesting case study is recently Jacinda Ardern's decision to step down and resign. And I think that's something really refreshing, that she said, I'm not the right person for the job at this point in time. And how many times have we seen that, from male leaders over the years, that they have to be forced out of power and pushed to resign. I think that's a really new and interesting narrative that we should reflect on, that it's not about clinging to power, and that's not often the most effective way to govern. So I think women have fresh takes to bring to leadership roles. And yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I fully take your point that again, we're back to that thing about gender stereotyping, and well, that's the kind of job for you, but the hard power stuff and the difficult ones are kept reserved for men. On Ardern, I think it's really interesting to reflect as well. And I was talking to some people from New Zealand, that she put up with a level of vituperation that normal politicians never got in New Zealand, and this was a whole new ballgame, partly to do with social media, partly because she was a young woman in power. And who was doing a very effective job. But she certainly paid a heavier price for her prominent role, primarily because she was a woman. And so that kind of took a toll as well. Eleanor, did you want to comment on the kind of...
I'll just make 2 quick points, actually. Thanks. Really interesting discussion. There's a very good researcher, I think her name is O'Rourke, actually. She's here at Essex University, but she coined a phrase, glass cliff. It's well known in organizational development circles. And basically, and we saw it in the diplomatic services and the UN, the appointment of women once the crap had hit the fan, excuse my language, but, situation is worse. So when things were plain sailing, or even in companies, corporates, when the growth cycle was up, but when it came to making redundancies, so the women actually were not just having to show merit or capacity at a regular operating environment, they're supposed to actually do a turnaround and pull something out of the hole. And so they're set up to fail. Yeah. And I must say, it's a classic observation. I hope we're moving beyond the trend of that, and that the understanding of leadership is a bit more composite. I would say the other thing is, Eamon, you made a good point about, needing to get into the pathways and the whatever. Speaking from academic experience and policy experience, it's also about language, policy, and discourse. The feminization almost as a form of abuse of certain policy areas. So they're diminished and feminized almost in how they're spoken about. So therefore they're soft issues. I hate that term, frankly, hard power, soft power, it's all power. Yeah. Or even we're seeing it in the context of Ukraine and even mainstream diplomacy. You can't mention diplomacy, you can't mention peace. You're a traitor if you do, in some quarters and on a lot of social media. And so suddenly to talk about gender equality or talk about peace building or talk about human rights, it's also says a lot about what is valued in our society and political systems at any given time. Yeah. There was a time when the peace movement was huge. There was a time when human rights and the rights movement across the world was supreme. That was the whole purpose of the United Nations and the national architecture we have. So I do think that their institutions also change. I think Iraq and Afghanistan has had a big impact on the securitization of policy, of aid, of discourse around even the stuff, Eamon, we would have worked on the conflict resolution unit. That whole thing has shifted. So I think that coming back to women, peace and security, it's operating in a social and political and power-based. So keeping alive to how that's shifting and changing all the time is important.
So I think it's fair to say that we live in far more difficult times than we probably would have anticipated 20 years ago. I think 20 or 30 years ago, we would have assumed that we were on one trajectory and it was all going to be an awful lot better looking back. And in fact, it's not. There are parts where it's gotten better, but the forces are almost gathering. It's almost like a counter-revolution that we're seeing because the world has got much more negative. The world has got much more protectionist, much more competitive. We're talking about technological decoupling. We're talking about a new Cold War. We're talking about these wars breaking out, and of course the horrible implications of the American invasion of Iraq, which just spiraled all over the place. So that's kind of again quite sobering in many ways. Just to tack back on the issue of merit and so on that Roberta raised, I've seen those situations as well. We could almost coin a new word, meritrocious, because you could see these competitions and the outcome is not what it should have been, and you have to ask why did that happen? I will say in defense of my own department though, and I hope Niamh would agree with me on this one, I think we've done very well recruiting women, and in general the women candidates in my experience have always been far better than men candidates. The young men seem to be very lost these days, and women seem to be quite determined, very focused. They do very well in interviews. Sustaining their career trajectory is the difficult bit, because of the the family pressures and the biases as well about what kind of jobs they should be in. Sally, did you want to comment?
Yes, I do have a comment to make about that, because there are a lot of negatives, and we've listed a lot of them. We've listed what should work and it doesn't work. We've listed the atrocities, but I feel very, very strongly that the bottom line is that women are better off. They're a lot better off. We've got a lot more to do. Let me tell you one story. Do you remember, I think it was a year ago, it'll be 2 years in March, when that little craft called Perseverance landed on Mars? Do you know that, that was historical, wasn't it? What a huge, huge event. Do you know that was done by women astronauts? And do you remember, it was in the news when they were landing that little craft, it took 7 months to get there and then 7 minutes to land. And she referred to it, the women astronaut, as 7 minutes of terror. And once it was landed, they were interviewed. And one of the reporters said to her, how would you liken this? It took 7 months to get there, 7 minutes of terror to land it. You've been working on it for years. How would you liken it? And her answer was, I'd liken it to childbirth. And my heart leapt because, first of all, no one would ever have used that term before in terms of a fantastic, scientific, brilliant piece of work. And no one would ever have, and it was peopled by women. So what I'd like to respond to you, Ambassador, is we have a lot of work to do. I am disgusted by the way men are not taking responsibility for the wrongs for women. But at the end of the day, women are way better off. Those women in Bosnia, by the way, they went to The Hague and they made rape a war crime in 1998. That's huge. So I think we are better off, but we've got to stay at the job.
Great. We're coming to the end now, and I wanted to tack back to St. Bridget herself, but also all the little St. Bridgets out there, the little are the next generation of women coming up. And if you could, perhaps each of you reflect on the advice that you would give them, because they're gonna come across success, they're gonna come across failure, they're gonna come across bias. If you had to sum up a piece of advice that you would give to a young girl coming up and growing up in this world, what would it be? And maybe we'll start with you, Niamh.
Sure. I mean, it's a tough one. It's a philosophical one. I think probably if I had to give one piece of advice to a young St. Bridget or a young version of myself, I would say, the narrative we've heard over the past couple of years is quite a lot about leaning in and about women behaving like men in order to advance. And I don't think we need to do that. I think we can do it in our own way. So to be true to yourself, be true to who you are, work hard, be kind. It's not all about, power, cutthroat, masculine approaches, but to do things as you are yourself. So I think that would be my advice in a nutshell. Off the top of my head, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, no, very good. And kindness, I think, is a universal value that applies to absolutely everything, Eleanor.
I was going to suggest join a hurling club after hearing Roberta's story.
Not a bad suggestion.
And I actually
join a boys one.
Well, I had Ned Power, the Waterford goalkeeper, for my teacher in primary school. The only time Waterford won the All-Ireland, he was in goals. And he didn't care, boys or girls. We all had to get a hurley and a slitter and we had to run it up and down the field. Didn't matter.
Yeah.
I think dream big, because I think sometimes dreams are even withstood. I can remember things well-meaning teachers said to me when I said the most ridiculous things, when I was a school child, like maybe wanting to be a writer or, discussing politics, and what are you doing discussing politics? It should be of no interest to you. And I just think to dream big and speak your mind, really.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, no, my daughter reminded me the greatest thing that Disney ever said was you've got to have a dream because otherwise your dream can't come true. Which is not bad, actually, for a major corporation, but there we go. Roberta, but sorry, just on the point, it's actually a very good point about sport. I mean, I think one of the most public demonstrations of women's empowerment we see across the media is women in sport, women in soccer, women in the Olympics, women in rugby. There's nothing they can't do. And I think that sport, I think, has actually been quite good from that point of view, and I'm sure it has inspired young girls to do things they may not have thought about, or because the bias I know they've done studies on this, and it was that actress, I can't think of her name offhand, she was in Thelma and Louise. She's been doing some amazing work in Hollywood, tracking bias in Hollywood productions from cartoons onwards. The roles that the male and female cartoon character, it's incredible. It was shocking, actually, the degree to which these stereotypes are imposed from the get-go almost, But sorry, Roberta, and of course you have your family as well. And I'm sure you impart wisdom by doing as much as by saying. But if you had to say something,
getting back to that, yeah, I can see it firsthand. I have 2 girls and a boy, and you know, they get very positive experience at home, but it's amazing how it infiltrates into the mindset that boys can only do this or girls can do that. But I know that I'm on a winning track anyway. When I overheard my son saying to a friend of his, no, that doesn't matter, girls can do that as well, like, you know, which is playing the laser tag. So
you got an early champion there.
That's it. But to re-emphasize, I think I wrote down, as Neil was talking before that, I said, yeah, be your own person, be true to yourself, your authentic self, which can be very difficult as a woman, certainly in male-dominated organizations, as we want to be leaders or be part of the decision-making levels, because we're being told you have to behave this way, and if you act like over-aggressive, then you're too hard and too cold, and it's called gender incongruity. If you go against the perceived gender norms, you're not going to be accepted. So the advice I would say to the younger me and my children is, I said, be your own self. To quote David Pilkey's Little Petty, it's your colouring book. How you colour it is up to you. And be the best person that you can be. Don't be, it's not a competition. Like, these are quotes that I've read over the years. It's not a competition or a race. It's how you want to live your life. And it isn't a rerun. You only get one cut at the title. Like, you know, it's a live act. So enjoy the journey as you progress through life and be the best you can be. That's what I would say.
Right. Yeah, I think I've got to the stage of my career where I can say, if it ain't fun, don't do it. But it's not a bad approach either, you know. So, Sally, we'll leave the last word with you in terms of summing up a piece of advice that you would impart.
Well, first, I have to respond to the hurling story. When I was in Ireland in June, I had a hurling lesson. Now, it was in a pub, I admit, but I was picked out as the person they were going to use as the example for how to teach hurling. So I just want to know, I was trying to find the photo so I could add it to this. I do want to fit into Ireland, you see, so I am a hurler anyways. What would I say to I have young granddaughters, and I would say to them, you can do anything. You can do anything. The doors have been opened. You might have to make sure they stay open. And I hope you take us to the finish line, because the road is there for you. And we are there as your grandmothers, your mothers, your sisters, your world community, to help you go through that door. That's what I'd say to them.
Yeah, great. Listen, thank you all so much for participating on this St. Bridget's Day. As I said earlier, it's great to have this focal point for us to air some issues like this. It was fascinating, all of your contributions. I'm sure we could have kept going for much longer, but I want to thank you all again. Gurmila Mahagut, and I hope our audience got something from this conversation. I know I did.